All right. Good evening, all. I want to kind of thank our Mr. Mark Oster again. It's a pleasure for hosting this and our amazing panel. Just a quick note to folks here: just make sure you're on mute. The first 30 minutes, Mark is going to fire away questions for the panel, and then the last 30 minutes, we'll open it up to folks in the audience. If you have a question, you can either put it in the chat or if you want to raise your hand, I'll call on you. But again, just be aware that your microphone is on, so we don't get multiple things here. So I think some folks are muted. Just make sure you're muted. Mark, with that being said, take it away.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Of course, to my panel, actually, I'm quite excited about this, and I think we've got some really interesting people in this space. And first of all, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Mark Kester. I'm the founder of a company called The Players NIL. We are an NIL education company. And part of what I do is help facilitate education in lots of areas that I don't have any expertise in for sure, or even any knowledge about. So with that, I just want to introduce my panel first in no particular order, but Scott Garbus is a high school athletic leadership consultant. Scott, welcome to the panel.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to share with everybody today.
Great. Mariana Perez is the Assistant Director of Compliance and NIL Coordinator at Providence College. Mariana, welcome to the panel.
Hi, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. We've got Jack Betts. Jack, I don't know how to describe you. You've done a little bit of everything, but Division III student athlete, graduate school now, entrepreneur, and all-around good guy in the area of NIL and supporting athletes. Jack, welcome to the panel.
Mark, thank you for having me today.
Last but not least, but maybe one of the most interesting aspects given today's and recent news is our guest, Cal Stein, coming to us from Boston. He's a partner at Troutman Pepper and really an authority in NIL legal affairs. Cal, welcome to the panel.
Thanks, Mark. Happy to be here.
Great. So we're going to kind of progress. We're going to start with Scott because we're going to start with the young people, high school athletics, and we'll tell a story of how athletes today in high school and then moving into college with Jack and Mariana, and then we'll chime in with Cal from a legal perspective on all three of those levels of the interest. But Scott, I have one quick question for you. The first question is, what are you seeing in high school regarding NIL, and how are you preparing folks for this crazy world?
Yeah, I mean, it's come through fast, Mark. We met, it's only been about a year and a half ago, and the NIL has now been approved in, I think it's in 27 states now. So even over the last year and a half, this has exploded at the high school level. And I think for me, in the high school space, here's some things that I think we really need to focus on for our high school kids. I think that's educational and awareness. And I thank Mark for all his work that he's doing in that. That is so pivotal for our high school students just to understand what this all means. And so many parents and athletes are misinformed or uneducated about this space for high school students. And that goes from compliance, the guidelines, and this is all over the place. Each and every state is a little bit different. I think that we need to have mentorship programs for these student athletes. There needs to be a huge component on that financial literacy. So many kids are starting NILs. They don't have they don't have an LLC set up. They don't know the tax implications. Parents are unaware of that. And then I think there's the ethical considerations for me, especially at the high school level. I worry about kids signing, things that they shouldn't sign, maybe signing something as far as their NIL in perpetuity, whatever that might be, and just getting involved in an NIL deal that's not good for them and their eligibility at the college level. And then at the end of the day, for me, it's about continuing to monitor NIL and where it's going, and then supporting our student athletes and what they need. I think so many states are so vague in the rules and regulations and guidelines from state associations. It really comes down to, as athletic directors at the high school level, knowing what our state regulations, rules, and guidelines are, and then helping support our kids as much as we can to let them know, or pointing them in the right direction. Our parents giving them the resources and tools that they need to make, sound decisions for their students.
Great. Thank you. We're going to bring Cal in at some point here to talk about some of the legislative things, but just pause for 1 second, Cal. Jack, you recently graduated undergraduate school. You're in grad school now, but you're one of the first early adopters of NIL. The interesting part of it is you're not the traditional NIL profile that the news sensationalized. You were a D3 athlete and, basically a non-revenue sport at that level. First question, how did you know it was going to be big? What attracted you to it? And what were some of the early things that you did to build your brand and create opportunities?
Yeah, so it took me about, I'd say 6 months to actually begin to understand that these opportunities were equally available for everyone. It was unfortunate, but Division III athletes were kind of like the last demographic of individuals on the minds of individuals who were going to be engaging in NIL partnerships. And so my first partnership didn't happen until January of 2022. It was a DM via Instagram. They inquired as to whether or not I'd be interested in joining their NIL cohort. And I'm sitting there thinking, what the heck? What's the worst that can happen? This is the in I've been looking for around 6 months. And from then on, it just took off. Like you mentioned, being sort of a non-revenue sport, it was difficult to find prospective partners to even reach out to. But I took sort of a full-on approach. I was actually in a gap semester at the time. I had the decision to either go study abroad in Rome and graduate in the spring of 2023, or take a gap semester, play one more semester of football, and then graduate December 2023. Ask me, it's a pretty easy decision. So really day in, day out, I was sending out 15, 20-ish emails a day, trying to sell to these brands. As you mentioned, I'm not really a household name. I don't have the Ohio State wide receiver to lean on. I don't have the 100 reception, 1,000-yard, 10 touchdown, I guess, notoriety to lean on. So I had to sell Jack Betts as the entrepreneur, and reaching out to these companies, sort of being like, hey, I noticed that you don't have any Division III athletes in your group. I think this could be a really unique opportunity for you, and for me as well, to get more engaged in NIL. And obviously the rest is history. Obviously my approach became awfully successful, and with a portfolio of around 40-ish NIL partnerships at the moment. Now that I'm retired, obviously those have concluded, and now I'm more focusing on the educational side of things with the Make Your Own Legacy Academy, but I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later.
Great, great. Okay, Mariana, everyone's talking about college. We forgot about high school, unfortunately, but I still think it's going to be larger than college at some point. There's 8 million kids playing sports in high school, but you work at a college that has a very sophisticated NIL program, by the way. Congratulations for all your work, but give us a kind of top level view. What are you seeing in college with NIL? What are some of the things that are working? What are some of the things that make you nervous?
What aren't we seeing would be the easier question to answer, but it's the Wild West out here. Things are just constantly changing. So a lot of the time, especially in an administrative perspective, it's just constantly keeping your finger on the pulse just to see what happens, because the more kind of regulations you start to put in place in your school and your department, things change and then you have to alter it. So I think something that everyone is trying to do is just keep up with all the legislation. You do want to pay attention to, everything the NCAA is saying, but then at the same time, all of the lawsuits and legal cases that are going on, you really need to keep your pulse with all of the legislation in that area too. And kind of, it's almost like predicting what you think is going to happen a couple months from now based on just case precedent, based on things that are happening with the Supreme Court, with Congress, with everything. So it's a bit of a hectic time. But we are seeing a lot of student athletes really embrace NIL. They think it's a really good opportunity for them. We agree. I think just it completely depends on the institution. Some, really like to take a hands-off approach on NIL and just leave it up to the student athletes. Some institutions really like to embrace all the student athletes' brands, really support them in building their brands and kind of getting what they want out of it. So it's completely different school to school, and you see it. Everyone's NIL programs are set up completely differently. Everyone's approach is completely different, just depending on what you want NIL to look like at your school specifically. So since we're in a D1 institution and Providence is really embraced NIL in a way and is really supporting our student athletes for revenue and non-revenue sports. So from our perspective, our athletic director is really, really gung-ho about NIL and thinks that it's a great opportunity for the students, but it does definitely change a lot of things. I kind of work a dual role, so I'm also in compliance at the same time. So that's kind of where you see a lot of those changes. I find it beneficial to work kind of on both sides of the spectrum, just because you get to do things, you know, as the NCAA wants it. And then also you're aware of all the rules going on and things that are changing. So I think a lot of schools are approaching it completely differently. I'm sure we'll get into that, but it's pretty hectic time in college athletics right now.
Quick question, for those of you that don't know, a collective is essentially the booster club on steroids, right? It's the donors and the interested parties that have collectively pooled their money. Just a quick question, do you have a collective at Providence College?
We do have a collective at Providence College. They're called the Friar Family Collective, and they're our collective affiliate. But even with other schools, sometimes you see they have no collectives or multiple that they're affiliated with. So it's even that is just completely different institution to institution. But yeah, we do have a very great collective. They're really hard workers, and the student athletes really love them, and they work really well with them.
Great. Okay, Cal, this is, you know, we only have an hour and we're going to share some time. So I want to warn you that we can't listen to all of the things that are going on. But look, for those of us that are in this space, I try to follow it as close as I can, and it's confusing to me. Give us a summary of where we are legislatively and legally. Mariana spoke a little bit about the changing landscape. Just yesterday, I think, some rulings came out from the NCAA. The state of Virginia's got some ideas. Give us some idea where we're at right now.
Yeah, it's really challenging, and I think we've heard that a couple of times, and I can confirm that to be the case. The real reason it's so challenging is because there's rules that are coming from all sorts of different places. You've got the NCAA, for example, that issues its own rules in the form of NIL guidance documents. And we don't always know when those are coming out. Sometimes they will just drop one out of nowhere. It'll change things greatly, it'll change things not so greatly, and sometimes it's hard to tell. In addition, you've got new proposals that are being vetted and voted on, it seems like every month or so at the NCAA level. So you had mentioned, Mark, a proposal and a vote that happened just yesterday where the NCAA Division I Council approved some additional authority or additional activity by schools to help facilitate NIL deals in a greater way than they were permitted before. That, of course, runs directly contrary at times to guidance the NCAA released way back in October of 2022. So you have to kind of look at both of those to figure out what is now permitted. Outside of the NCAA rulemaking, you've got all this legislation that's out there, and I'll try to break it down as easily as I can between federal legislation and state legislation. The former, federal legislation, is easy. There is none. There are lots of bills that are working their way through Congress. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them because I don't view any of them as being anywhere close to something that could be passed. There's just not enough consensus, and quite frankly, Congress has other things that they are focusing on. The state level, it's a lot harder. It's a patchwork. Each state that has passed NIL legislation has a law unto itself. There are some things that are consistent, but there are many things that are not consistent. And what makes it even more difficult is state legislatures are constantly changing those laws, repealing them, amending them, trying to give, at times, it appears, their in-state institutions an advantage in the NIL space. And a good example is what you mentioned, Mark, which was the Commonwealth of Virginia recently passed a state NIL law that basically says, look, it prohibits athletic associations like the NCAA from taking adverse action against Virginia schools for doing things that are permitted by the state NIL law. And the Virginia state NIL law says institutions can pay student athletes NIL compensation directly. That conflicts with a long settled rule on the NCAA level. So we've got a little bit of a showdown brewing there, which will likely be resolved in a court somewhere, which of course is now the third kind of source of these rules. We have courts all over the country. Some of this has come all the way up to the Supreme Court, but we've also got federal courts in Tennessee, for example, issuing rulings that have impacts all over the country, invalidating certain NIL rules and validating others. So it is really a full-time job to stay on top of all of these different rules and rulings to know what is and isn't permitted on any given day.
Yeah, thank you for that summary. And I see Mariana nodding her head in acknowledgement. It's crazy. Scott, let's talk about high school. Cal mentioned there's almost a different legislative piece of paper in every state. But as a general rule, when you talk to high school administrators, and that's your job, that's your consulting business, how do you advise them? Number one, we understand the legislative thing may be difficult, and there's probably a place where you can read individual states. But what about helping the student athletes? How can we get high school administrators to be more involved and more supportive and more educational so that athletes don't make the mistakes that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I think it's probably twofold a little bit, Mark. Number one, I think it's as many things in life, when we don't know about something, there's a little bit of fear. We talk about, Cal just talked about it, court cases, legal actions. It gets scary for high school athletic directors, especially when they don't have that type of background, as Mariana and a couple of the other people on this panel, they are, in that every single day. Our high school athletic directors, and I talk about this all the time, they're managing their programs. They have so many things to manage, it's hard to sometimes lead. So for me, it's educating athletic directors on NIL, teaching them what their state guidelines are. And I think very many states are very loose in their interpretations of NIL. But I've talked to many athletic directors now who have had issues with a student being deemed ineligible and losing their amateur status because the parents, the student athlete, the schools don't even know what the rules are of their state athletic association. So being proactive for athletic directors is so important. So whatever that resource might be to help your kids, guide them through this, talk about it at your, student and parent meetings as much as possible, put as much information on social media for your students to digest. Mark, obviously you have a ton of great resources for athletic directors and student athletes to teach them, at the end of the day, this is all about education. So I'm so excited and glad there are people out there like yourself and many other who are providing our student athletes and athletic directors and coaches the education that they need to really support their student athletes. Because that's the scary part, is like people just don't know. And now kids are losing eligibility and potentially losing the opportunity to go play in sports because they've lost their eligibility. So many important things to do with that education, athletic directors becoming aware of what's going on, and educating our student athletes and parents is for me is pivotal and so important.
Great, thank you. Jack, you started Make Your Own Legacy. You were a champion of NIL education and athletes as influencers before people knew what it was. What are some of the things you've learned in working with the 40 plus athletes that you've worked with? Is there a common theme to who's interested in NIL, how they take advantage of it, some of the mistakes that they made, some of the success that they had? Give us what you've learned since you launched Make Your Own Legacy Academy.
So I think one of the biggest things that I've learned is that these athletes come to me and they're like, look, you're a Division III guy. You're a dude who, we have one televised game per year with Amherst football against Williams. And a lot of these athletes are in this similar situation. And they're like, we didn't even think that NIL was even going to be a thing for athletes like ourselves, coming out of the smaller market level, coming out of these underserved institutions where it's just no dig at Amherst. We don't have the type of resources required to invest in our athletes. And so a lot of the athletes who come to me, I think what I've learned the most is that they didn't think it was even possible. They come to me kind of saying like, look, I was out there Googling. I'm just trying to find a way, trying to find some guidance, and your name came across my line. And being a Division III athlete, it's an inspiration. That's what a lot of the athletes come to me and say. And now that I've been working with 60-ish athletes from across the country, I think the majority of us are thinking we're not going to be playing our sport professionally. And that's just the reality of it. I know my name's not going to be called in the NFL draft later I think it's this week, actually. I know that's the reality. And so sort of establishing ourselves, looking at NIL as a means of, I like to call it as an entrepreneurial incubator. A lot of these athletes come to me kind of saying like, look, we've seen that what you've done, we've seen the professional relationships you've developed, we've seen this professional skill set that you've developed. I want to learn that as well. So what we as athletes are kind of perceiving NIL as, specifically at the smaller market level, we're perceiving it as an entrepreneurial incubator. We're looking at it in developing these skills that'll be applicable 5, 10, 15 years down the line. I know somebody like myself who wants to pursue a career in sports, whether it be sports marketing, sports management. I'm going to SMU to pursue my master's in sport management. A lot of the skills that I've learned and a lot of the relationships that I've created during my time in NIL, there's going to be a lot of carryover. And a lot of my athletes are saying the same thing. Like as they're graduating, they're coming to me and thanking them, helping them with not only landing NIL deals, but content creation, all the things that go into these NIL partnerships will carry over. It will carry over into a professional career of whatever they're going to be pursuing. So NIL has a lot of incredible benefits, and those are just a couple of the things that I've not only learned myself, I've not only gathered myself, but I've heard some feedback from a lot of the athletes that I've worked with. They're saying a lot of the same things.
Awesome. I'm going to steal that phrase, entrepreneurial incubator.
Feel free.
Dave Maloney is a content partner of mine, curriculum partner, and he had a great saying that I quote in my book, and that is that NIL is not a 4-year thing, it's a 40-year thing. So in line with what you're saying. Mariana, so you're a Division I NIL thought leader, advisor, education. You probably have to do everything. What's happening at the college level? Who's successful? Who's interested? What resources are you bringing to bear to help support student athletes at Providence College?
Yeah, so again, most institutions kind of handle this their own way and very, very differently. It varies across the board. But for us specifically, our athletic director is just very supportive of NIL and really wants student athletes to take advantage of it and wants that education to be a focal point for them, just because, depending on the school and depending on the athlete and whether they're a revenue sport or not, and even some non-revenue sports, they make a significant amount of money. So it's just being able to handle that money, the financial literacy aspect of it, taxes, stuff like that. It's, you don't want to set the kids that you're, working with up for failure. It's really important that they know, especially a lot of them, they're 18, 19, 20 years old. Like you are suddenly now dealing with running your own brand, running an LLC. Sometimes you're having significant income, you're working with collectives and the money's coming in, and what do you do with it? How do you handle it? Stuff like that. So I think that mainly we get a lot of questions. I like to make myself available to student athletes, so they kind of come on a meeting basis, a one-on-one meeting basis, if they want advice, if they aren't sure what they want to do in NIL, if they don't even know what it is. We get that a lot with incoming students, freshmen, and internationals too. So that's like a whole other separate issue with international students, but a lot of them will just come to me one-on-one and, ask for advice. They're saying, I want to take advantage of this, but I'm not sure how. The revenue sports are pretty lucky because our collective works very, very closely with them. But when you come from a non-revenue sport, it is a little bit more hands-on for yourself. And so we get a lot of really, entrepreneurial minded students that really want to take advantage of building their brand and reaching out to businesses and everything like that. So, since I also in compliance at the beginning of the year, we always do mandatory compliance meetings for all of the teams and all of the coaches. So during those meetings, we cover NCAA rules, all of the bylaws, and then we have, since all of this has, come to fruition, we've tacked on NIL education to that mandatory compliance meeting so that it's baseline education. We have a financial advisor come every year to talk to all of our student athletes about taxes, how to file taxes, 1099s, investing, like to handle all of that amount of money that certain student athletes get. We also utilize Open Doors, which a lot of schools do utilize as a disclosure platform. They can also go on there to reach out to companies to connect with. Companies can reach out to them. And it gives us the ability to view kind of what students are doing, what businesses they're connecting with. We can see what kind of activities they're doing just to kind of maintain that eligibility perspective. If we see anything that is questionable, we can flag it and bring it up with them. But yeah, like Scott was even saying before, it is just, these are very young students at the end of the day, and they're getting contracts that they don't necessarily understand. Some of them have agents now for NIL purposes, which is allowed under the NCAA. So they have agents to do stuff for them, but the ones that don't, that really want to take advantage of NIL, they're kind of on their own. It's very expensive to hire an agent if you're not in a revenue sport and your income isn't that great. It is definitely a burden to hire an agent. So a lot of them are just kind of doing it themselves, and that's where my role kind of plays a part, and they can come see me and I can direct them, where they need to go. So it's an interesting time.
Yeah, it's a great summer. You've got a lot on your plate.
Yeah.
Cal, we're going to jump to you quick. I've got two things written down here. I'm going to combine them. The Dartmouth NLRB situation and athletes as employees. Where are we at? Where do you think we're going?
So where we're at is they're not employees yet. But where we're going, in my view, is that someday soon, they likely will be employees, or will be something that is a lot like an employee, but called something else. And the reason I say that is, it's pretty clear that is where we are heading from all of the signs we're getting. And I go back to, the Supreme Court decision that kind of kicked this whole thing off, which was the Alston decision. And some people may be familiar with it, but one of the Supreme Court justices in that decision, in a concurring opinion, issued what I will call a scathing indictment of the NCAA amateurism model. And I think for anyone who read that opinion, signaled, at least as far as he is concerned, and I would argue likely as far as most of the Supreme Court is concerned, if that issue about students as athletes as employees ever came before that court, I think we know how they're likely to rule. They are likely to rule that they are, or should be, employees. So I think we are getting there. Now, the Dartmouth NLRB decision is certainly another step in that direction. I will caution folks not to read too much into that. The decision that was made by a regional NLRB board, not the national one. So it still has to kind of work its way through that system, which can take a lot of time. There have been regional boards that have made similar rulings in the past. I would kind of be surprised if it worked its way through the national system before we got some sort of guidance, either through national legislation, or perhaps more likely some deal worked out at the NCAA level, where they create a new class of individuals that are like employees, but not exactly employees. The last thing I'll say on this is none of it's going to happen all that quickly, because there are a lot of kind of interlocking things that need to be addressed. One is Title IX. As folks I'm sure are familiar with, Title IX, as soon as the institutions, the schools themselves, implicate Title IX, which would create all sorts of problems. So it's my view that either Title IX itself is going to have to be amended, which is going to require some congressional action, or the NCAA is going to have to figure out some classification of these student athletes such that their salaries or the monies being paid to them don't implicate Title IX in a way that makes it unworkable.
That's crazy. Jack, you were, at the forefront of this. What were some of the obstacles you faced from your coach, from your athletic department, Did they think you were crazy? Did they support you? Did they question you? Were they afraid you were going to ruin their school? I'm sure you were vilified at some level.
No, my athletic department, my coaches, teammates, everybody, I was met with overwhelming levels of support, which I'm grateful for. I could tell you when we came in that fall of 2021, right after the decision was made that summer, we basically got handed like a 5-page packet from our compliance officer that was like, this is what NIL is, this is what you do if you get a deal. And you could tell like the overwhelming feeling in the room was just kind of like, none of these kids are even going to engage in any of this. So we don't even know why we're having this meeting in the first place. But fast forward like 5 or 6 months-ish, once January comes around, I'm on my gap semester. I'm not actually on campus. I'm actually sitting at this desk doing most of my business. But I start posting some of my partnerships. Some of the things that I start posting start gaining some ground, and some teammates start texting me and they're like, this is really cool. Like, we didn't even think this was possible. All just that again, that feeling that most of Division III athletes were sort of having right when this decision was made, didn't think it was possible. Even some of my coaches were like, okay, now you're a sponsored athlete, now you're big time, of course, joking around. But I'd say some of the biggest obstacles came from, I don't know, simply going out and finding some partners, simply going out and finding what brands even want to work with Division III athletes like myself. So I'd say the biggest obstacle that I faced wasn't really on campus. I mean, you could consider it on campus if you want, because my school didn't have the type of resources to be providing us with, but I went out and did it myself. I hustled for it, and at the end of the day, nobody else is going to give it to you. You got to go out and get it yourself. So that's what I did. Amherst supported me through and through. I had to sit down one of my last semesters on campus with the president of Amherst, who was just newly inaugurated. We had a discussion about the value that NIL brings to the athletes on campus. So I think there's definitely an uptick. There's a trend on campus that a lot more athletes are going to want to engage in it. I think within the NESCAC, I had a couple athletes reaching out to me kind of saying like, okay, we're seeing some stuff going on Amherst campus. Like, we want to see some more stuff on Tufts, Wesley, and Trinity, all these other campuses. So I'm hoping that in the near future, some more on-campus, I guess, motion is going to be happening. But for the time being, it's really just all on the athletes.
Great, great. Scott, complete this sentence for me, please. I'm a high school athlete and I should be interested in NIL because.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of everyone has mentioned this, that, there's a bunch of entrepreneurial student athletes out there, very similar to Jack at the high school level. I think it gives our kids the opportunity to make money. We've had a number of kids that have done camps with their names on it. So if they're trying to raise money, they love sports. They're trying to, find that part-time job that fits in nicely with their high school sports. I go, this is a perfect opportunity for those kids. But I would tell schools to work with their student athletes, because I think there's going to be a point where student athletes and schools at the high school level will be competing for the same money. So how can we as athletic administrators work with our student athletes and make sure that we're not competing for the same dollars in our own community to raise funds for the programs? And so many high schools are in need of the local support to even drive their athletic department. And in many states, like for instance in Iowa, the school district pays for transportation and coaches' salaries. Everything else comes from the athletic department and generating money off of gate receipts, booster clubs, and then corporate and sponsorship. So very much the same money that our student athletes will be trying to go after for NIL funds also.
Yeah, I think that's a problem at the college level too, right, Mariana? I mean, have you gotten in the middle of conflicts with donors, whether they donate to the collective or to the school in the traditional manner? How do you navigate that right now?
Yeah, our biggest issue with that specifically, and kind of where NIL is going, is a lot of collectives are trying to take on acquiring 501c status or 501(c)(3) status to become like a charitable organization, so that it's a tax write-off for boosters. That entices a lot of boosters to donate to the collective because they would get a tax write-off for that. For us, it's not too much of a competition, just because boosters donating to the school and school athletic programs through Providence College, that is a tax write-off. So that's, their charitable donation. And then boosters that strictly want to see the success of the, athletic department really rise and support student athletes. A lot of them are PC alum, like they're very passionate sports fans, and they have a really, really good alumni network. So they have been willing to, donate to the collective and it not be a tax write-off. And that's just something that they're willing to do. Our collective right now is in the process of acquiring that status in order to have that kind of tax write-off, but it's a very slow process. And I think that with the trajectory of NIL now, a lot of that might come in-house. So it's, you do see a lot of conflict. Something that they meet about a lot is just, if the collective does become a 501(c) and then, are more boosters going to be donating to the collective than the school? And there's a lot of conflict in that sense. But right now it's not too much of an issue for us because they're two separate entities and organizations with two different kind of tax implications. But I know a lot of schools are dealing with that issue because it is competition now. Less people are donating to the actual educational institution and donating to the collective.
Yeah. Cal, so that brings up a great question. So, it appears that we are headed towards NIL deals being facilitated by the school. I read the tea leaves that collectives may be rolled into the school operations just because the logistics of operating a collective and the fundraising donor fatigue is a real issue. So let's say that we're headed that direction. What will schools be allowed to do, and what will be the role of a collective? Will it be collectives 3 years, 5 years from now?
Yeah, my guess is that maybe not 3 years, but 5 years from now, there probably won't be collectives anymore. Schools have really, from the beginning of NIL, when these collectives popped up, they've made it known that their preference would be to handle NIL in-house, is what they call it. There was a high-profile Division I school in Texas that tried to do that. They tried to use an existing school fundraising entity with that tax-exempt status to serve as a collective and pay out the NIL deals. And the NCAA sent a memo to all member institutions reminding them that not only can schools not do it, but entities that are acting on behalf of schools, closely affiliated with schools, couldn't do it either. So basically putting the kibosh on that. And I actually remember when that came out at the time, I thought, well, I understand why the NCAA is doing this. But at the same time, it's really got to be, I think, pretty attractive to the NCAA as an institution to have these NIL deals being run through a school rather than these third parties over which the NCAA has no jurisdiction, no authority, and no visibility or insight. Charlie Baker, the NCAA president, former governor of my state, Massachusetts, one of his big things so far about NIL has been protecting student athletes, visibility for student athletes. And one of the easiest, and I would argue most effective ways to do that is to allow the schools to supplant the collectives, because the collectives can operate in a way that is more shielded from scrutiny, visibility, all of that than the schools can. So I have long thought that there's real benefit to the NCAA as an institution to allowing schools to do it themselves. And I think it's just a matter of time before we get there. The step that I mentioned earlier, the vote that happened yesterday, is a step in that direction. It's allowing schools more license and more authority to facilitate these deals. I think it's only a matter of time before schools are allowed to actually pay these NIL deals, which means, collecting the money themselves and paying it out without running afoul of NCAA rules.
Okay, great. Be close to good to follow. Anthony D'Onofrio, as our host, I think you've got some questions for the panel. When we've got about 20 minutes left, let's try and facilitate some of those.
Absolutely. I think Patrick was just asked, following up on this question, on the collective questions, Do you see college athletics programs expanding their departments to absorb the collectives?
I think that's what we just answered is, we're headed in that direction from an operations standpoint, from an NCAA compliance or a transparency standpoint is what Cal said. So I think the answer is, it seems like we're headed in that direction.
Another one, another student that could not hop on. The job market in NIL. Where do you see, as specifically my students, where can they be kind of poking around for jobs in the NIL space?
I think Mariana, you can answer that. You're in that space. What does your staff look like? What kind of people are you hiring? What kind of administrative jobs do you see coming down the pike?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of schools are going to end up trying to hire NIL coordinators just because for a compliance department, you're already dealing with a ton, and it's essentially what Providence did for myself, but you are dealing with a ton as a compliance department, especially for smaller schools. You tend to have much smaller compliance departments, so you just don't have the bandwidth to be keeping up with NIL legislation, tracking all of that in addition to dealing with all the bylaws, all the relationships with your coaches, your athletic director, everything else going on behind the scenes, and hundreds of student athletes. So I can definitely see that becoming a thing. I think a lot of schools are starting to lean in that direction for hiring even an NIL department. I was fortunate enough that I went to law school, and while I was in law school, I interned at a lot of different schools. I interned at a D2 school and a D1 school during my time there. And it's interesting to see how different the approaches is per school, but I worked at San Diego State for a time and they had an NIL coordinator, and they were one of the first schools to hire one because of that bandwidth issue. And so I can definitely see that becoming a thing throughout the space. But then at the same time, as a law student, I saw other law students, interning at clinics that are now gearing toward just helping student athletes, providing them pro bono, legal advice, have redlining contracts for them. That I can see is becoming quite a popular space in terms of on the legal side, and law firms having clinics to do that for student athletes, and law schools supporting those kinds of clinics. So I think it depends like kind of what route you want to go, if you want to go institutional or legal, or student athlete representatives, stuff like that, I think are going to be really popular routes, and it's only going to grow because NIL's certainly not going away anytime soon.
Yeah. Jack, at the Division III level, obviously you don't have the resources. You already mentioned that. You don't have an NIL department. But what are the key skills that athletes who want to go out and do this themselves like you did, what are the areas of skill development that they should be looking at?
From my experience, I think what I've really benefited the most from is learning how, like, the types of outreach. I've learned that when I was reaching out to these prospective partners, I started out with Instagram DMs, didn't work. Then I started going like some various other routes, didn't work. And I finally came to, okay, what if I just reached out to them directly via email, reached out to their partnership division, reached out to their, I don't know, their whatever divisions that take care of NIL. I know a lot of these brands that I worked with, it was still relatively new for them, so they didn't necessarily have a division for that. So I just got sent directly to customer service. But learning ways in which you could present yourself both concisely and effectively. I know within my approach, I didn't really talk a lot about what I've done on the football field. I've talked more about what I've done entrepreneurially in regards to NIL, some other things that I've been doing on campus, for example. And on top of that, I think content creation is extremely important. It is a social media oriented business when you begin thinking about what an athlete's brand really consists of. So being able to represent yourself accurately, portray yourself as an individual that brands want to be tempted to work with. I think those are the top two skills a lot of these athletes can begin working in, and it can translate to a professional career. I know that a couple people I've been speaking with, their content creation skills that they've honed during their time in NIL, it's led to possible marketing internships. And a lot of these brands are relatively new to it. So having this sort of individual on your team, having this sort of individual in your corner, if you're a brand, from a brand's perspective, is extremely beneficial. So those are a couple of things that come to mind. I'll let you know if anything else comes up.
Great. So Anthony, I think the answer is there that, you know, if you have a interest and or a skill in, you know, influencer relations, video editing, technology, software, there's room for growth in the NIL space, not just administrative like Mariana, but, you know, advising athletes about the aspects that Jack just talked about. So what's your next question you've got?
Holly Galvin, I'm not sure, did they answer your question as well? I see there's a thread here, so I just want to make sure I answer it twice. Holly, are you still on the line?
Yeah, I think Mariana kind of answered it, but you know, if Cal had anything to add, or you know, great answer by Mariana though.
Excellent. And then I think I saw it. Jordan, did all your answers, questions get answered as well?
Yep. Been on my book.
Excellent. Another student asked, can international students, athletes participate as well?
That's a Cal question.
Yeah, this is a really tricky issue. I can see Mariana shaking her head. I can't even imagine trying to deal with it from an institutional standpoint. And it's so tricky because it's not really a question of NIL law so much as it is an issue of US immigration law. And the short of it is most international students are in the attending United States colleges are here on a student visa, which is a particular type of visa that does not allow them to work. And by working, it means earning income from active activities. So they can't get a job, they can't do NIL endorsements that require actual conduct and activity while here, or else they risk their visa status, which would obviously be extremely problematic. Now, there are kind of workarounds for this, and the one that I have seen the most often utilized is that it does not apparently, and I'm by no means an immigration expert, but apparently it does not violate the student status to earn what's called passive income. So if you do something and earn residuals for it, for example, that is permitted. So what we've actually seen, and what I've had a number of institutions I work with do, particularly at the Division I basketball level, is a team will go play in a tournament in another country. And while they're in that other country, a student athlete can perform NIL activity there. So, for example, sign 100 basketballs. And they do the activity there, then they sell those off or license them to the collective, who then over time sells them, and the student athlete will get paid residuals from that. It's a workaround, but it's not ideal. And we saw it come up. This issue came up quite a bit in the recent NCAA basketball tournament because one of the top players in the country was complaining about this because he's actually a Canadian citizen. So it's something that really needs to be addressed, but I fear is not going to be because, again, it's going to require some congressional action. So I think we are still stuck with schools doing the best they can for their international students to do these workarounds to make it passive but not active income.
Cal, just a quick question. I assume that applies to high school students as well.
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay. Anthony.
Yep, we got another one. Dr. Pam Wojnar. What about NAIA and NJCAA member schools? The NAIA made an association-wide partnership with Open Doors, for example. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'll just, and Mariana said that Providence is an Open Doors customer. Open Doors is a marketplace, right? So it's a facilitator of relationships between athletes and brands, particularly local brands typically, but also has a compliance component. Is that correct, Mariana? Right?
Yeah, it has a compliance component and also an education component for businesses and student athletes, depending on what kind of account you have.
Yeah, and I think, Anthony, the answer is any institution that wants to get a contract with Open Doors is able to do that.
What, can I jump in?
Yep.
What I was saying is the NAIA, as a college athletic membership association, partnered association-wide with Open Doors, so that's available for every student athlete that they have. And all the conversation's been on NCAA, and I'm sure at a high school level, you have to counsel for JUCOs as well as NAIA. And I was just kind of curious if anybody had any additional information on that.
So I can speak to it a little bit. You know, the NCAA certainly has been the Collegiate Athlete Association that's been most out front with their regulations. To my understanding, and I work primarily with NCAA institutions, but to my understanding, NAIA does not have any specific NIL restrictions the way the NCAA does. However, what that really means is that the student athletes and the schools are subject to the individual state laws, which, as we mentioned, can be an absolute bear to keep track of. So it's not necessarily that there are no rules. It's just that the rules are a little bit disparate, and you can have different schools that operate in different states having different things that are permissible and not permissible. I will confess I'm not entirely sure what the state of the regulation is at the NJCAA, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was similar situation.
Anthony,
Excuse me, Anna, where are we at currently with putting more regulations in place for NIL agents?
oof, that's a tough one. Cal, any thoughts on that?
Sorry, it is certainly something that Charlie Baker has mentioned. It fits hand in glove with his themes of more transparency and more visibility and consumer protection type rules. The consumers being in his view the student athletes. So I think it's something that's on the radar, but I have not seen very much progress on it on an NCAA wide level. There are some state laws that have NIL agent requirements like registration and things like that. And I've also seen some individual schools require that as well, which I think is a really, really smart thing for schools to be doing. Not all of them have, and some do it because the state law requires, but some do it because it's just, I think, good, smart practice. So I think eventually we will see a little bit more on that, on this. But at the same time, if we do transition away from collectives and towards NIL coming in-house, it may become less of an issue.
Another one here from Max Hoffman. How has the transfer portal and NIL affected each other? And so far, are the recent changes to the transfer portal causing any trends in NIL?
I think, Anthony, I could just answer that question. This is one of the myths that the news is, perpetrating, is that NIL and the collective portal are connected, or the transfer portal are connected. We have two different boxes of athletes at the university level. The smallest box, roughly about 2% of the 500,000 collegiate athletes today, are, as Mariana described, available to be supported by collectives. Most of those activities are based on performance. If we're really honest, it's pay for play. It's used for recruiting and retention. So although the NCAA has had some guidance around that, the honest answer is the collective really doesn't care what the student athlete's social media following is. They want to know if they can help them win games. The transfer portal, unfortunately, came from the NCAA as well simultaneously, and both of these were released with little to no guidance and no guardrails, which has created the chaos. And so now you have essentially free agency with one-year contracts and no salary cap. Okay, those are not really NIL activities. Okay, real NIL is what our friend here, Jack Betts, is all about, and that is a real return on investment relationship with a brand or an entity that's going to pay him for his influence. And I want to make that distinction very clear to our audience.
I think, and in my opinion, with the transfer portal, The biggest issue is what happens to these kids who enter the portal and they don't find a home. We have them in portal limbo. Not only are they vying for contracts and opportunities to play and things like that, but what message does that send to the rest of the kids coming behind them? Granted, we're only in year 3 or 4 of this whole situation. But the portal, I've been on record talking to, NIL directors across the country. It's like, look, you can put a budget behind recruiting in the portal, get you an experienced player, win a few games, probably even win a championship or 2. But we're thinking long term, when you can't retain some of the top talent, you can see what Colorado's going through right now. I love Coach Prime, but losing talent is losing talent. I don't care what sport it is. And when you've been a part of the situation, you kind of know what's going on in these, these locker rooms and different things like that. Some of these kids are leaving these institutions thinking they're going to find a home right away, and they don't. That's my biggest concern with the portal. But I mean, NIL is NIL, and as Mariana said, it is the wild, wild west. And I think we do need a little bit more regulation on it. But as far as letting the kids leave and do whatever they want to do, that's one thing. But then you have kids who are ruining your graduation rates across the country too. The long-term impact that comes behind leaving the school and not being able to finish your degree, which is the most important thing to me.
Jack, at the Division III level, and the people that you work with, almost 60 athletes, athletes in the mid-major level, D2, D3 level, looking for an opportunity to play up. What are you seeing, and what's going behind some of those decisions for kids to enter the transfer portal, trying to move up a level of athletics?
I don't think I've seen anything like that come across my internet will hear me.
We can hear you.
Uh-oh. Hello.
Yep.
Uh-oh.
Hey, Scott, let me turn it to you. At the high school level, it's becoming an issue now. Transfer between schools, recruitment from private schools, especially high-end athletic schools. What are you seeing?
I would tell you that I think the collective is going to be seen at the high school level also. It's probably been happening, on the fringes, but now that this NIL is out, I think there's definitely opportunity at the high school level where collectives will be formed, and there will be powerhouses at the high school level and have collectives behind that. Like there could be, you could be a local high school and they're like, hey, we want to be good in basketball. And there's a car wash in town that says, my son's going to be playing for this team in a couple of years, and we're going to go out and find, 3 other, prolific basketball players, and we're going to make a great team. And I think we're going to see that. And with the limited guidelines that state associations that I've seen thus far have put out, I think that's going to be a problem that we're going to see in the near future of high school athletics.
Yeah, I agree. Anthony, we're almost out of time. Any last questions or statements that you'd like to share with everyone?
No, I just want to thank everyone. And Mark, as always, a pleasure. Mark, for my students and for the audience there, can you give, I guess, a plug of what you do and where they can find your website?
Well, first of all, I want to thank the panel. I want to thank Scott and Mariana and Jack and Cal for giving up their time in the evening on the East Coast here in the Midwest. And I respect each and every one of you for the work that you're doing and your connection. My mission is to use athletics to better your life and to use athletics to better the lives of the people around you. And I think the people on this panel are committed to that, which is what I'm most interested in. I think it's a dangerous, slippery slope. I think we're in a challenging time, but I think Jack Betts is a great example of, if it's done properly, if it's managed properly, the amazing opportunities that are out there for athletes to enjoy their celebrity and create lifelong opportunities. So I want to thank the panel and all the listeners, and just say that, Anthony, we appreciate you and Endicott College and the administration for letting us have this discussion.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Thank you, panel, and thank you to all that participated.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.
You too.